I'm Alexander Novakovic. I'm from social movement Flame, and today we will talk about many different issues about crisis of the left in the world, about world crisis, and about war in Ukraine. Today's position of the left, and this term involves many particular political organizations, from progressive democratic socialists up to anarchists, is in many cases unclear. That being said, we can notice that the lack of international solidarity considering many different issues, nuclear disarmament, NATO, neoliberalism, war in Ukraine, and the new world crisis that is hitting global south particularly hard. But this is not the whole picture. There is an inner crisis of the left that persists since the fall of Berlin Wall and shows no sign of remission. Today, I will talk about these and many other issues with our guest, writer, poet, and visual artist, Arturo Desimone. He was born in Aruba in 1984 and has published also numerous articles about different social and political issues in magazines and sites such as CounterPunch, Compact Mag, Balkanist Open Democracy, DemocraciaAbierta, if I'm right with my pronunciation, Berfrois UK, The Wire, as well as for DiEM25 page. He has been also a prominent member of DiEM25 group for geopolitics called DSC, Peace and International Policy. So, Arturo, welcome. I would like to ask you the first question. We will talk about the position of the left today in our first segment. Well, the political left today seems to be almost non-existent and lacking the basic solidarity. There are examples of leftists and progressives moving towards the center, and even center-right, like in the UK, France, Germany, with their Labour, Socialist, and Socialist Democrat parties. And they are all living proof of that. What are the main reasons for that lack of solidarity and almost non-existent left in the classical way that we see it?
Thank you for proposing this conversation, for the question. I suppose you have a better, well, I mean, to begin with, of course, I mean, it's impossible not to look at the date of 1989 and the official end of the Cold War. And in 1989, I think I was 5, so you would have a better memory, clearer memory of that. I mean, I was interested in monsters, which is kind of similar to geopolitics, I suppose, but I wasn't aware of that. But of course, seriously, of course, we lost the Cold War. And I think we have a problem on the left because we are trying to escape the responsibility rather than assume that, like, if I say we lost the Cold War, people on the left will be very, very uncomfortable because they're trying to escape this problematic tradition. Like on a few of the events of DiEM25, the late editor of Open Democracy, who was quite helpful to me, my essays 10 years ago, I started writing on politics. Rosemary Bechler, she said, it's important to acknowledge, or she said that this word progressive is a great idea because it helps us to get away from the problematic tradition of the left. And I think we have to look at what happened to the Cold War, and and the non-aligned movement. So I think during the Cold War, there was an alternative, and there were various models. that were an alternative to capitalism. So you had a model that was violently instated in the Soviet Union, revolution against feudal monarchy. And then you had the reformist movements in the West, and all of the labor parties. Well, it would be strange to suggest that the labor parties were somewhat connected to Moscow, but communist parties in the West were Italian Communist Party. But there was this idea of reformism. So Russia and China, as well as Mexico at some point, and a few other countries in the world, more than a few. Majority of the countries in the world had violent revolutions, mostly against colonialism. I think that in the west of Europe, in the post-war era, there was an idea that reformism would be a way to, within Western democracies, after the Second World War and after the end of colonialism, this would be a way to win social rights, for majorities and for minorities. And these social rights were rather expensive, of course. And they were expensive, at least in the eyes of the ruling elites. The ruling elites in the west of Europe, especially, but also in North America, but more in the west of Europe, they found themselves faced with two choices, right? One was to accept or reject these reformist politics of labor parties, which were traditionally many of them were quite anti-communist. Many of the labor parties, social democratic parties in the west of Europe, were very anti-communist and pro-colonial at some point, but then they somewhat changed. But regardless of, there were various, there were all these Western movements, labor parties, communist parties, but they were playing the social democratic game in parliaments or liberal democracy in order to incrementally win social rights for the majority, the minorities as well. And the elites, the ruling elites, were faced with two threats. Either we, either engage democratically and with every defeat concede these social rights, which are expensive for the pocketbook of the elites, and which they are not particularly excited about, or run the risk of the violence of revolution. And the violence of revolution is not just the Russian Revolution, although, of course, every royal family, aristocratic family, and many people who are the bourgeoisie, who have nothing to do with aristocracy, they noticed the Russian Revolution and they were afraid of it. They were afraid of ending up like the Romanovs for many, many decades. But there was another threat, which was much more recent, much more fresh in memory: the loss of the colonies. The elites of a country like the Netherlands, for example, to this day, they remember the trauma of having lost Indonesia. And they remember that much more vividly than the Second World War.
Por lo que ahora ha llegado a la mejor parte, las armas, y algunos datos curiosos. Comenzaremos por las armas. Nos estamos enfocando solamente en las armas del ejército indonesio. Para las armas de mano tenemos bastante, y si bien la mayoría fueron capturadas, estas van desde simples pistolas como...
Having lost Indonesia was much more important to them. Indonesia was
you're referring to loss of Indonesia, which was in 1945, actually, after the war, almost immediately. After the war, they lost Indonesia, and it was their biggest colony. If you see the map of Netherlands and you see Indonesia, you see why they were missing it so bad.
Absolutely, yeah. Belgium lost colonies. Yes, and of course England England had consoled itself, the British elites had consoled themselves with the fact that even though they lost the United States, they had India, and so and of course the British. I remember long discussions late at night. A friend of mine, a Palestinian friend from a former PLO family that had gone into more liberal politics. And he was adamantly insisting, that nonviolent resistance is the only way. He would give me examples like the Black Panthers, for example, who compared to Martin Luther King's movement, the Black Panthers had failed. And they had a violent rhetoric. But at some point, after a lot of debate, because I was reading a lot about India at the time, and about the different movements there, if you look at why the British gave in to Gandhi at some point, Gandhi's peace movement and Ambedkar's peace movement. Ambedkar is much lesser known than Gandhi, the leader of the untouchables. It's because at some point they realized, especially if they're weakened resources after the Second World War, it would be better to deal with the non-violent movement than with violence groups. The threat of violence, was always there. And so I think that ruling elites having in the back of their minds the trauma of violent uprisings, these nationalists in Indonesia, which became part of the non-aligned movement, I believe.
Yeah, they did.
The French, the violence with which they lost their colonies, because that was a point at which the elites had very, very close contact with a large third world proletariat that was using language that was a mix of nationalism which had a lot of problems in it, religious nationalism, but also Marxism, dogmatic Marxism, very dogmatic. And so the trauma of the ruling elites at the time about these violent uprisings made them come to the rationalization or the understanding that it's better to make concessions to the pressures of these organized, less violent, reformist groups that want to win social rights by playing the game of liberal democracy.
Hence, three famous decades from 1945 to 1975. Yes. Hence the welfare state.
Yes, the welfare state is born out of a number of agreements, a number of concessions. The welfare state and also our civil liberties, free speech for normal people, right to organize, all of these came through concessions. And in a certain way, the elites, the ruling elites, were a little less Eurocentric because they traveled a lot to the colonies where they had power. They had this terrifying confrontation. And so I think the big emancipation of the ruling elites, how in the language of the New Left, the 1960s, we use words like empowered, mixed pop psychology with ideas of revolution. So we say, I threw off my shackles. Well, I think Margaret Thatcher, in a sense, was the one who came along and tried to tell ruling elites to assume victory, to no longer fear the alternative, but to act like you've already won as violently as possible. And so I think, I'm talking to you, I'm in Argentina, where I sometimes am, and I have relatives, personal history here. So I think with Argentina, with the Falklands War, the Malvinas, whatever you want to call these lousy islands, this was the last, farcical attempt This was a farcical, in the Falklands War. It began shortly before I was born in 1982. So there was this General Galtieri, who was a drunk, who was a favorite of the global security elites. He, of course, killed thousands of people. Very brutal dictator, though the least brutal of the three dictators of that period, maybe. Galtieri was beloved by Jean Kirkpatrick, who adored him for the way he executed secular nationalist young people. Galtieri was beloved in Washington, beloved by people of surrounding Nixon. So he was a faithful servant of Washington. He was also an Argentinian general. And in the Argentine military, there was a tradition of nationalism and the belief in the fatherland and the homeland. And Galtieri overnight declared this war against the British, right?
Yeah, we know he occupied the islands inhabited by a couple of thousand of British subjects, and that was about it until the British came to prove that they can rule the waves.
In the interest of objectivity, who, sir, do you believe was responsible for this attack of ours?
En el interés de la objetividad, ¿quién cree usted, señor presidente, que fue responsable de este ataque contra nosotros? Yes. Vea, creo que debe ser un grupo muy reducido. I think it's a very small group. Que no está buscando o contribuyendo al objetivo de la paz. That is not contributing to the objective of peace.
Yeah, well, Joe Biden immediately expressed his adamant support for England in crushing a former ally like Argentina. The Argentinians had believed that because there was a treaty that American states shall not invade or attack each other, therefore this treaty would not be betrayed. And of course, the treaty was immediately betrayed by the United States and Chile, of course.
We need to do a little bit narrow it down, but it is a good example because you found these two dictators on two opposite sides. Pinochet or Pinochet. Pinochet is the right pronunciation because he's half Basque, half Breton, basically. The general that ruled Chile helped the UK to get information about Argentinians. And Argentinians, on the other hand, were using French weapons. So it is the symbol of Mirage airplanes and rockets.
Yeah.
So basically, you can see that international capitalism was fighting itself. Basically, the NATO allies had different interests that caused basically that war. And the fun fact is that it's not the fun fact, but it was repeating throughout the history. Look at Biafra in Nigeria. It was the same situation, basically.
Yeah.
France and USA plus USSR taking different sides. So, okay, it was like this in international theater, and I get the point. If we can summarize,
the point I was trying to make is just that Galtieri making this very superficial anti-colonial gesture. He was immediately gobbled up, immediately vanquished. Argentinian young soldiers have been traumatized, and so here Thatcher she reclaimed this virility for ruling elites that had been afraid. They had been afraid of the alternative, whatever you want to call the alternative where they have to make any concessions or be worried about these movements that presented them. because she defeated Argentina at the time. Even Gaddafi of Libya had sent some aid to Argentina to fight the British, but England humiliated Argentina. And I think that was an important, that was one of many important turning points. The Thatcher era told the ruling elites that their victory, which is neoliberalism, capitalism, where there's no democratic conflict of that results in anything we could call democracy. Just this total victory for business and ruling elites. This was Thatcher made this into her battle cry, that just acting this way, you can make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, of course, was very extremely violent in Central America, but also pushed through a neoliberalism, which George Herbert Bush the Elder called it voodoo economics at first, before Reagan gave him a position. So this victory of neoliberalism had to do with that, I think, and that's the starting points for the demise of the left, and the defeat.
Yeah,
the material political theater.
I can ask you one or two questions. Let's summarize. Okay. Until there was a threat from the Russian bear or Soviet bear on the east,
yes,
the West had to make certain Western elites needed to make some concessions to working class of the Western world. But when that big evil bear perished or turned into small bear, let's call him in Russian, medvezhenak, the small bear, you know, small bear, just the Russian Federation, nothing else. So then Medvezhenak. Okay. So basically, I'm not Russian, but I speak Russian. So basically, what happened was this. When
you point that out, it's good you point that out, or they take the show off YouTube.
What do I say?
It's good you point out that you're not Russian, or they take the show off YouTube.
Well, I'm obviously Serbian because the link is in Serbian, and it's written that the center of my movement is in Belgrade, Serbia. So obviously I am a Serb, not a Russian. Some people mistake that I'm just Slav, not even the Eastern Slav, but the Southern Slav. But that's another point. Let's cut it. Long story short, let's come back to this. So basically, there is no threat. And now we can do whatever we please, and now we can dismantle the welfare state, basically. The signal was given by the end of the 1970s when Margaret Thatcher came to power and when Ronald Reagan came to power, and then everything that was considering dealing with social state, welfare state went down the hill. So that's the small way to wrap it up, but it's not the whole thing. The one thing that came from this conversation when you were talking about anti-colonial movements and about Gandhi, there is one part of the story in anti-colonial struggle during the period from 1945 to 1990 that no one mentions, is that even Gandhi's movement, which was peaceful, satyagraha, peaceful way of fighting, not showing any kind of resistance whatsoever, had another wing, which was pretty military wing, and which used weapons to achieve the national freedom. The same goes for Nelson Mandela. There was Nelson Mandela, but there was a peaceful leader of the South African movement, but there was also Joe Slovo, who was leading the guerrillas, fighting for that same movement. So you always had two wings, political wing and military wing. What I'm trying to say...
I'm not so certain that Mandela was never in the armed insurgency. I was pretty sure.
Well, he couldn't be if he was like for 30 years in prison. He maybe took some part, took some actions that were dealing with guerrilla, and I think he was arrested after the Sharpeville massacre, basically. Sharpeville in South Africa. So basically, it is like after 1961. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the basic thing is that none of the countries that have gained the freedom from the ex-imperial powers gained it with in a peaceful manner. All of them needed to take arms in their hands in this way or another. And this is also one shocking story when you're talking about the gaining of independence and decolonization. Take a look at the Kenya, take a look at the Mozambique, Angola, Indonesia, India, also Palestine and State of Israel. They needed to take arms against the colonial powers over there to gain the independence.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not so sure about the inefficacy of nonviolent movements. I also see there's a self-destructive tendency now with Western movements around racial issues or any issue to somewhat romanticize violent insurrection or the Black Panthers. And I mean, I wasn't saying that non-violence is ineffective, but I think that one has to try to somewhat understand the psychology of the ruling elites to see how this historical change took place. And I do find that, you know, even the successes of nonviolent movements, which in some places were massive, still depended partly on the fear among certain ruling elites who were a bit more, were a bit more humanitarian in their values. Like the British, for example, this nonviolent resistance wouldn't have worked in Argentina. Never, not with a dictatorship. Would have just wiped people off the earth, the face of the earth. So I think that the victory of the Cold War had to do with, and the defeat of the current left, it had something to do with this ideological change and this battle cry that took place. And you know, they won, but you know, the Western capitalists, post-liberal, neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, they won. But it's a victory that was, I think, partly a Pyrrhic victory, because if you look now at, for example, Reagan's Republican Party, there's an insurgency within the Republican Party that has many people more worried than they were worried about the left, because now you have young conservatives who are beginning to trash Reagan, who was once a saint in that party. Now they're saying he's the one who sold us out to neoliberalism. They have a slightly anti-war position. So there's a part of the right that's changing. And the system right now is particularly worried about that part of the rights of conservatives who have adopted anti-war positions and who are no longer seeing any value in the heritage of Reaganism, which was neoliberalism, right? And so that's very interesting, and the system is pretty worried about them. So, and of course the perpetual embarrassments in the UK are, you know, the UK does not have the same image it once had, and that's part of this legacy of Thatcher, of course. And so
we talked. Excuse me, Arturo. We talked about the legacy of Thatcher, but can I ask you the next question? One of the impressions I have about most of today's political organizations in Europe, those that claim to be leftist, is that they did not draw red lines regarding certain issues, denuclearization, nuclear disarmament, NATO. Furthermore, they show no will to change economic systems altogether. So what is their agenda, if their agenda is not the change of economic system, and if it's not the change of international politics, and if it's not the internationalism, and if it's not the demilitarization? So what's the agenda of those parties today, basically?
Well, I think we have to specify what we mean with the left.
Well, self-presenting left, you know, when you look at the parties, mostly of them are basically social democratic in Europe, from today's Labour to social democrats in Germany, socialists in France, if they are socialists, and etc., etc., etc. You know, Western European democracies, but also democratic socialists in USA and stuff like that.
Well, I think we have to make a sharp distinction between the democratic socialists like the DSA in the United States and social democrats in Europe. Social democrats in Europe at least understood that the system they were defending is just social democracy. Many of these labor parties had always been anti-communist, had very always in favor of NATO. I don't think the problem is not that they've changed, but that they have not changed that position, despite that it is an anachronism. It's harder now to argue that NATO is an anachronism, of course, but I mean, these parties, the labor parties in Europe, social democrats, they were always centrists, but we are at a stage where there's no distinction, I guess, where the left is, because of so many defeats, I think the left, we're trying to cling to our few victories, meaning the places where our little bits of rhetoric, often about gender, feminism, so forth, or ecology, where that has become mainstream. So a few of these talking points entered the liberal center, and that's why many leftists in the West, they fixate completely on things that they have in common with the center, because there's I think a lack of faith that we can recapture what to me most defines the left. If I want to at all belong to the left, if I'm not in any way to be interested in the left, I am interested in the geopolitics side, and internationalism, in anti-imperialism particularly, and in the idea or the project to rethink or to put an end to the dominant financial structures, the rule of the financial firms. That to me is what's important, and that's all I particularly care about.
Okay. But I can ask you, and this may be the provocative question. You wrote one article recently where you said that these identity policies are international trend. Basically, they are not reserved just for the West. They are reserved also for the global South as well.
Yes.
The article that I'm referring to is the one that you said that Argentina is woke and Argentina is broke. So
I didn't say that.
Can you explain what you meant with what?
Editors choose the title.
Okay.
Woke, I would never use the rhyme like woke and broke.
Okay, so can you explain to us what is the essence of the article? I won't say that to the people that watch us. It is better to for the author to explain what it is all about.
Yes. Well, the article in Compact magazine shows how the current presidency constantly tries to change the subject from, you know, whether or not to fulfill its material promises to Argentinians who are getting poorer all the time. It's a very critical situation here, and instead of taking measures such as, you know, there was a very corrupt agro-industrial giant called Vicentin, and the president was talking about expropriating it, nationalizing it to feed the people during this crisis. But instead, the he suddenly decided he can't expropriate the Vicentin because there's a provincial judge who won't, you know, some excuse that shows that he is, Alberto is a bit like, you know, these other figures, a bit like Jeremy Corbyn, a bit like Sanders, some doesn't want to fights with friends, and so I'm not the first one to call this government the extreme center. There was a writer in the Argentinian Le Monde Diplomatique who accused Alberto Fernandez's government of being the extreme center. But I think what Alberto Fernandez constantly does is he finds refuge in policies to, for example, reform the Spanish language to make it a less macho language, and so.
Well, will these reforms feed Argentinian people?
Of course not. No. Well,
of course not. What is the benefit for Argentinian people from these reforms?
These campaigns are harmful, and it's a form of stealing because, you know, like I have no problem with the fact that many teenagers speak this gender neutral language now. It's their subculture. It's not for these politicians and attorneys and for the mainstream hegemony to take that subculture and make that the official culture. So I see nothing positive about it, really.
Okay. Excuse me for, we can go back to that later on because you were mentioning the things that matter to you the most. So can you tell me about your work concerning future European policies and world policies? You were the member of the group that was working on geopolitical questions, trying to make it the part of the program of the progressive movement that was DiEM25, or Democracy in Europe movement.
You heard of that group?
Yeah, I heard of that group. Yes, Peace and International Policy. It is its official name. It is dealing with geopolitics, but I would like to hear more about it from you. Of course, I know a lot about it, but you were one of the prominent members of that group. So yeah. Can you tell me something about, but let's not waste too much time.
My hope is that it would be a dialogue, because of course you were also quite prominent in that.
Yeah, I was, and I will take to say something about my part of the story, or my my way of seeing things later on. But right now, I hear from you first, and of course, I was also the member of the DiEM25 and member of that group. Later on, I will say about something something myself. But first, I would let you.
I mean, my position on the European Union has always been pragmatic. While it's there, while it exists, if it continues to, we have to do something about it. We have to do something with it. Whether you dislike it, whether you don't want it to be there, whether you do want it, it's there. And we see now also, that's the fundamental point. It's not going away anytime soon. And like one of the few lines of Varoufakis that I kind of like is when he says it's like Hotel California, right? Where you can't check out.
Anytime you like, but you can never leave.
You can never leave. And you see that also with the, that right-wing insurgency in England. Also, it becomes more complicated. It's like quicksand, right? So if the right, powerful as it is, the right is much more powerful than we are. If they can't get out of it, right? Because they have, the fight of Brexit against the European Union is a disagreement between the ruling elites as to what is the best way for them to launder their money or whatever. So that's what that conflict is really about at the highest levels. At the lowest levels, it's about much more than that, of course. The discontents with the EU, which I understand, and I joined the DM because of that discontents. But while it's there, and we have to do something about it. And I saw the EU foreign policy, or the absence of EU foreign policy, it's a terrible waste of opportunities. Europe is very close to the Middle East. It's the major trade partner for the Middle East. You have enormous immigrant communities that's from the nearby continents. There are young people in these immigrant communities who are very interested in both the political fate of the country they're in, as well as the countries their parents came from, right?
Yes.
This prison called the EU. And so while it's there, we have to do something about it. I don't mean to blow it up, but rather to change the foreign policy of the EU. It's a very important opportunity. And I want us to take advantage of that. And I think that DM very much lacked foreign policy orientation. DM also, Eurocentrism is not news, of course. But I think the only way for DM to be able to credibly, hold on to any kind of left-wing identity, which it doesn't really try to have, it tries to evade that, but for it to be at all interesting, period, it would have to have a lot more focus on geopolitics, on foreign policy, and also many of the more interesting members, they, people like from former Yugoslavia who, confronted with the way European countries supported this bombing and the breakup of Yugoslavia. So we can't get anywhere without geopolitics. And I think it's a good idea to have a federated movement in Europe that's about the foreign policy of Europe. It's just, it's necessary. All the elements are there, but we just have to combine them and do something with it. And but that means something more than, I don't know if you saw it, the statements that we need another non-aligned movement. There's like 2 paragraphs, the recent statements that Varoufakis with Turkish self-help writer Jeremy Corbyn, they presented a 2-paragraph statement about the need to create a new non-aligned movement. So this is, it's not serious, obviously.
Well, one of the problems with the modern left is that we easily digress. So I will try to keep the focus as much as I can. But basically, yes, it is interesting that you said DiEM25 is pan-European movement, and yes, many of the things that were done in that movement
in name
it is, but as someone who comes from a non-EU country, I felt like it wasn't basically the case, and I think that always in all the communication in the movement, it was always talk about EU. Okay, I get it. EU is big. It covers most of the European continent minus Russia, Belarus, Serbia, and a few other smaller countries. I get it. But if you are all-inclusive, be all-inclusive, or don't be just the movement that unifies EU. But it is not the only problem of it. It had also it has the same problem that keeps repeating itself over and over again. For example, let's not forget, DiEM25 is the one of the two main players in a progressive international. One is DiEM25, and the other one is Bernie Sanders Institute. And the rest of the organizations in PI are nothing but icing on the cake.
Well,
So basically, they didn't manage to create a progressive international because they didn't manage to create the true European international. So if you make one mistake once, you will repeat it again, and it is perpetuating. It is repeating itself again. And
I'm not so sure that the Sanders Institute really is interested or active in the. I think that Sanders.
Well, okay. Let me rephrase that. But the most known name to most of the people, to the two most prestigious names on the list of PI members are those two names. All the other organizations, as I already said, no one has heard about them, most of them. I know about a few of them because I know them from Balkans, because they are something like Don't Let the Belgrade Drown and We Can, or Možemo in Croatia. They are certain political organizations that have a certain influence in the local communities, but that's all.
Well, I think that we make a mistake in confusing endorsements with active membership. Sanders is, as a politician, is completely fixated on the United States.
Mm-hmm.
He withdrew his opposition to the Yemen war. So if Sanders is in any kind of such internationalist organization, I think he should be kicked out. But the PI and DiEM, I mean, okay, look, well, one thing is endorsements from famous people who want to give their blessing to a movement, like Članke has been criticized by people who write for Jacobin or CounterPunch, but he will also say, he will make a statement saying CounterPunch is doing wonderful things, the Jacobin, they're great, because he uses his stature to support what are good initiatives, at least better than nothing. But that doesn't mean that Noam Chomsky is an editor of Jacobin. And so, and I think it's the same with these other two organizations that you mentioned. I think that probably, I don't want to comment on what the PI should do. I think the problem also with the expectations created by DiEM and the PI is these are similar problems. So DiEM is the left-wing movement to democratize the European Union. Therefore, if you say there has to be another another movement like to democratize the European Union and so on, which is not supportive of NATO, people will refer you to DiEM25. And if you talk about internationalism, people might refer you to the PI. Although now I think that's very doubtful, and we have to see these more as experiments, which is not to dismiss that they might,
So the situation is much worse than I have described, vis-a-vis their functionality and vis-a-vis their strength, political strength to do anything.
The Progressive International gives me the impression that it's a team of academics who they believe that lending their expertise or their university education, their being Western, lending these staples of their legitimacy to a cause like Venezuela or the Western Sahara. They will thereby, prevent atrocities in the Western Sahara. So like, for example, they often have statements by very, very important, illustrious academics from the West, and they try to bring this aura of respectability. So they make a team of experts who go to Venezuela and who are people who have a background in Western universities, and they confirm what has already been confirmed. Yes, the Smartmatic machines that count the votes in Venezuela are quite all right. So no election fraud here. So United States, don't invade. Let's go to Western Sahara. Let's go to Peru, and we give our aura of moral legitimacy because we are academics, because we are people who are seen as legit. They're very concerned with getting, and so then we bring the attention of the legit people in the West to Peru to look at the scandal here. So we have just to prevent the catastrophe from getting out of hand. And I think this is a position that I think that for a Western solidarity movement, it would be okay if we were in that era when there were other things going on, right? Western solidarity movements did a lot of good, but they did not put an end to the regime in South Africa or the regime in another country, right? And so it's simply not enough. It's too obsessed also with expertocracy. I believe they have very good intentions, right? But I don't find that they are what. I mean, I found it very heartbreaking, to hear my friend, a political organizer in Azerbaijan, kept asking me about the PI. He was very obsessed with the PI because, of course, in that country, if you say there's a new international, right, that has a whole meaning. And in your country, of course, as well.
Of course. We'll get back to that later.
Yeah. So that sets up expectations, but these expectations are words in the air, and they are words in the air, just as good as yours or mine. And I think that talking about, it's important to talk about what went wrong in the PI, but it's also important to talk about, and also, I think I had another point about identity politics, but it's also important to talk about what we can do now, irrespective of.
Talking about that, that brings me to our next question. For example, I have a feeling that European progressives, European left, often forgets that it is not the only left in the world, and that there are strong left-wing parties or progressive parties and movements in Latin America and Central America too. Many leftists. I'm talking now from my Balkans perspective. We're rejoicing about recent events when Bolivian junta was overthrown by popular struggle and Jair Bolsonaro lost the elections in Brazil to Lula. Can you make a comparison with the left-winged parties on other continents? Can you make the comparison between European leftist parties and the aforementioned movements in Southern America? Can you tell me, are there any leftist parties on the global South or movements that can be like role models of sorts for their comrades in Europe and America. I mean, Northern America.
Well, it depends where you look on the timeline. And unfortunately, now there are more and more similarities. And all the similarities are bad and disheartening. But if you go a little bit back on the timeline, you see that the Latin American left lacks a problem that became very, very visible in the European left, like around the time when you had Diem and Die Linke, and you had all this sectarian fragmentation that has always been the bane curse upon the left. In Latin America, at some point, it was like that, because the left here was very much influenced by European leftists, like in Argentina, not just Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil also.
In Chile, for example, is it the case with Boric in Chile?
I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay, cool.
But many of these anarchists and communists came from Italy, from Europe, right? And they were very sectarian. They're very sectarian. Then something happened called Peronism. And Peronism had an equivalent in Brazil and a few other countries, where there was a very chaotic movement that had many different ideologies and people in it.
Excuse me, Arturo, can you tell for the people who do not know? I know who Juan Perón was, and I know how he ruled Argentina, but most of the people don't know. Can you tell me one or two sentences about who Juan Perón was? And then you can use the term Peronism without fear of being, like asked, what is it, or something like that.
Peronism is populism without the connotations it has in Europe, because in Europe, you say populist, you're talking about racism or something. But Latin American populism is basically Peronism.
Cool.
Perón, like Chavez, he was, maybe that's not a good comparison, but Perón was a dissident of the Argentine military. Argentina was a country where politics as such did not exist, really. There was no real electoral popular politics. And the left was quite frustrated in Argentina because its social programs for workers' rights, it could not really get beyond a certain threshold. But then there was some kind of mutation that happened, that Perón came along, and he was another military person, but the exception. And he won the first election in Argentina after the Second World War, and he began to incorporate different ideologies in the country that appealed to the working majority, to the workers. And so he basically, Peronism introduced many of the basic workers' rights, like the weekends. The communists did not dream of the weekend, right? We had lofty, but he introduced workers' rights, and also Perón, despite that in appearance, in the aesthetics of the movement, it seemed a bit right-wing, or a bit like a third way movement. Was one of the first political leaders who dismantled a certain kind of racist policy in Argentina, where people from the provinces who were like half Indian, half indigenous, they couldn't access certain things, they couldn't access certain parts of the country. So Perón transformed Latin American politics because he had many imitators in the continent. And that was then I know this is a lot of information. I'm sorry.
Well, we get the general idea, but basically you say that today the social politics in Latin America are basically Peronist in a way, mostly.
In a way,
Or
he was the
at the time being.
Yes, he was the forerunner, and at the time the left was divided. For Marxists, it was clear we are not Peronists, but Peron is what the people believe in. Large majority of the people, they respond emotionally to the Perons. So what are we going to do? Part of the left was completely against any kind of cooperation with Peronism. And there are many, many things to criticize in Peronism, like the many authoritarian tendencies that were terrible. I'm not a Peronist myself, but what I'm saying is that the Latin American left really did away with the sectarianism that is one of the many ways in which the Western left and the European left destroys itself, like you saw. You had, for example, Varoufakis, Diem, Die Linke, Mélenchon's, whatever came before Mélenchon. They all have.
You had French Communist Party and Socialists before that, yeah.
Right. So any divergence means you open up a temple for only people who are completely with that program, and so you have the left tries to create homogeneity. It doesn't want internal contradictions. The left wants no internal contradictions in Europe, and that makes it very sterile. And it's largely a middle-class affair also. So Latin American left movements did not have that. Now they're becoming that. Now with globalization and the fact that the intellectual elites of every Latin American leftist country, are academics who did their PhD in the United States or England or Canada, and they come back with these ideas. Now we are also going down that road, and Boric is a very clear example of that. And what's happening inside Lula's party is also very clear. The identity turn towards identity politics in Lula's party, which cost a lot of popularity in Brazil, where people try to cancel carnival costumes that are problematic, and of course that gives a big advantage to Bolsonaro, right? So the Latin American left is also deteriorating in that sense, in a very similar trajectory. It still does accept more discussion, internal contradictions, rather than everyone starting, rather than this thing we see in Europe that looks a bit like Protestantism, new sect being declared every month, and that divides the people.
One question also bothers me is that we were talking previously, and we are going around in circles about the fact that there is no real international movement that has principles of class solidarity and class struggle and has a real anti-imperialist agenda. Do you see any possibility that that kind of movement will appear, not right now, but within, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, for example? Because as we have previously seen, the example of the N25 and its collapse, basically, it failed to do its mission, and PI also leads to the question: is there any other alternative, and is there any other possibility to create international socialist movement that would work?
Yeah, I think so. I think that without calling it international socialist movement off the bat, right away, I mean, I think that we can conserve our ideology completely, but what we have to do is present projects in the short term that starts somewhere and that will interest young people. I think in your country in particular would be an interesting starting point, because and that will interest young people. I think in your country in particular would be an interesting starting point, because let's say you in Belgrade, if you announce, let's have a group discussion in could be anywhere, in a cafe, anywhere. Young people who want to talk about the urgent need to reform the UN, radical UN reform. I think need is a movement that has an emphasis on young people and people who are not so young, but who can work with young people, of the way in which for a radical reform of the UN, United Nations. And I think Belgrade is a good place to begin, because of the way in which, first of all, it's the only part of Eastern Europe where people are not seduced and bewitched by NATO, because NATO committed war crimes against people in recent memory. People can remember that.
Of course.
That's not total victory. That's not the victory I want. That's not the victory John wants. I've been saying we should go on the ground. We should announce there's going to be American casualties. We should go to Belgrade, and we should have a Japanese, German-style occupation of that country.
Why, some of you ask, have I been so relentless on Serbia and Costa Nostra, who I do not trust? Why have I been so persistent in not providing aid?
My age remember that, and were victims of that. And also, Belgrade is where there was a part of the Serbian population that was not seduced by the ethno-nationalism, but which saw in Srebrenica from
Srebrenica. Okay. Yes.
Saw the complete emasculation and impotence of the current United Nations peacekeepers.
Serbs did not attack. The UN assigned inexperienced Dutch soldiers to Srebrenica. All were under the impression that there would be no need to fight, and that police presence would be enough to deter the Serbs. But Serb General Mladic had other plans. On the surface, he was a caring man. In front of television cameras, he pledged his safety for the young girls, mothers of Srebrenica. But behind the scenes is a different story. From morning till night, he forced thousands of Serb families to separate. One way, women and daughters; the other way, husbands and fathers to their deaths. The role of the Dutch commander, Tom Karamans, is also controversial. Ratko Mladic plied the UN officer with gifts. Soon after, he orders his soldiers to execute thousands of Muslims.
Absolutely.
So these two events are not, you don't have to be a communist or a Trotskyist or an atheist or anything to see the moral, seriousness of these two events, the need to talk about them, and the impetus to start a movement to make sure that never happens again. Since our ideology itself is not popular now, we don't have to put a red flag over the place where we have a meeting about this, but we attract people who have every kind of belief system, but who have a commitment to want to do this kind of organizing, which will involve young people as well as not only, of course, older people, will involve podcasts, theater, discussions, reading groups, all the time appealing to more people, because the United Nations is the world's largest organization.
Mhm.
It's a complete failure. It has given no answers for the refugee crisis, the greatest in history, unprecedented refugee crisis. It has given no solution. It has wallowed in impotence. It has allowed this completely illiterate Biden administration to, Biden never read a book about Ukraine, but he can determine what you or I are allowed to think or say about Ukraine.
Yes.
The only book he has read about Ukraine is the accounting or checkbook for Burisma, right? But he can determine this information, right? So this disaster, it can only be answered with a movement, with the future that puts the futureless young people of every ethnic background, whatever, at the fore, because they have to be a counterweight to the current international organizations that are betraying them, selling them out, compensating for their emptiness with political correctness and wokeness. So
you have mentioned one interesting question or interesting segment that we will right now step into, and that it is basically the second chapter of our discussion, and it is about war in Ukraine and the position of left. Today, there is no massive international anti-war movement against the war in Ukraine. We've seen, as you know, many anti-war movements that were launched by an extent from the pacifist movement against the war in Vietnam, and afterwards other colonial wars, and of course wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had a huge opposition and huge anti-war demonstrations all over the world. But now you don't have an anti-war movement against the war in Ukraine. And any calls for negotiations right now are labeled, even negotiations, peace talks, are labeled as pro-Russian. Many European leftists, even Slavoj Žižek, are openly supporting Ukraine.
Žižek did his Christopher Hitchens impersonation.
I started thinking about that, but let's just focus on the question: is this again a battle for European values, or is it just an opportunism or mix between the first and the latter?
Well, there are two questions, which is, what happened to the left here on the Ukraine issue? That's the harder of the two. The other question is, why is there the Ukraine war? I think that before he, while he was still free, Julian Assange had an explanation for why there's a never-ending war in Afghanistan. And the reason why there's a never-ending war in Afghanistan, according to him, I was really surprised. I hadn't thought about this. He said that he believed that the global security elite needs a place to wash its money, right? Somehow Afghanistan was a zone for money laundering for the global security elite and the weapons rackets. Now, I don't know exactly how that worked, but and we can't ask Assange right now. But
unfortunately, yes, we cannot ask Assange.
Yeah, but it's kind of, it is sensible. And so if, let's say that was true, let's say that thesis is correct, then what happens after the United States leaves Afghanistan? Because if that money laundering zone was so important for the global security elites, they must be pretty pissed at Biden, right? That he left there, because that was really good for their interests. So then he had to open up a new place for the, and Ukraine is ideal for that, because it's a black hole where weapons and money and all kinds of things disappear. It has the most notorious black markets in Europe for weapons particularly. So I won't, dwell too much on his thesis. It's just a theory, right? But Biden, like other Democrats, is extremely responsive to the militarists and neoliberal cliques that dominate in the Democratic Party, and doesn't care about these young, woke leftists at all, and humiliates them regularly, and they take it from him. They accept the humiliation that he regularly doles out to AOC, who I once kind of, thought was admirable. And so the Ukraine, also Afghanistan was a tremendous, the images that came from the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, a place we've completely forgotten, of course. The images of that were so ugly. It was a blow to the North American imperial self-esteem and the kind of image that North Americans, especially Democrats, but also Republicans, want to project of themselves in the world for a long time, of liberators, nation builders, and the American security establishment had used Afghanistan and the plights of the Afghan women, who have been completely, of course, abandoned now, in order to legitimize American imperial foreign policy, to give a sheen of heroism. But meanwhile, of course, what was happening was that NATO soldiers were being terribly, had a terrible time in Afghanistan. They were losing legs. It was quite common for a soldier to step on a Taliban landmine and lose his legs and his genitals. And so NATO became war weary. And so that's why it's necessary. But Biden discovered, or the Americans discovered in Afghanistan, they were reminded of the power of guerrilla warfare, because the Afghan Taliban are, guerrillas who know that those mountains in a way that Google Earth never will. Were able to defeat and destroy the most powerful military alliance in that place for that moment in time. And that reminded them of, of course, it's just another chapter in the war, the terror wars, but also.
I agree with you on that, but if you take a look at the Afghani history, you will see the series of defeats of all the conquering forces that came to that country.
Right.
Since the times of Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, up until the NATO, basically. The point is, you made a good comparison with Afghanistan, but can we go back to Ukraine?
Yeah, because the Biden administration was reminded of the power and the efficacy of guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan, which is why they're supporting guerrilla warfare in Ukraine against Russia.
Although Ukraine is not fighting the guerrilla war, they still have regular army units. It's not the typical guerrilla war.
Well, yeah.
They control most of their territory. It is very different from Afghanistan. If Russia occupied whole of Ukraine, then they could have guerrilla units. Although they have guerrilla units on parts of occupied territories.
Yeah, I think partly, yes, there are the Ukrainian armed forces, but the Ukrainian armed forces consist mostly of drafted civilian men. Officially, I think every man between 18 and 65, and in practice, I think there are a lot of teenagers too, 15-year-old boys who are fighting, and getting blown to pieces, of course. And so, but I wasn't changing the subject, because I think, we are constantly manipulated by all these terrifying, events in the news as if they're separate from each other, but they're all part of it, They're all very much interdependent, and you can't really separate the imperial embarrassment in Afghanistan for the need for Ukraine, because Ukraine made everyone forget those very unheroic images in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan reminded Washington already knew that guerrilla warfare, urban or, well, Afghanistan is not urban, but it's very effective. It's very effective, so they're hoping to use that against Russia. Hillary also said something to the effect of creating Afghanistan for the Russians. But of course, it's a very stupid comparison, because for Russians, Ukraine is very familiar territory. Slavic languages are very, very similar. Ukraine has a very intimate meaning to Russians. And of course, not always in the way that Ukrainians would like. But the establishment has for a while been hopefully comparing Ukraine to Afghanistan, referring to, when they supported the Mujahideen against the Russians. But it's a very bad comparison made by the elites, by the security elites. And yet, these are interconnected disasters. So I don't believe that Russia is easily defeated in this conflict, but there's no end in sight.
I think that there is no winner in this war. Basically, it is the war of attrition.
Hoda, stay with us. We want to hear more of your thoughts on his visit, but we're just going to get the latest from the UN Secretary. He spoke a short time ago in Bucha.
Okay, when you see this, when you see, when we see this horrendous sight, it makes me feel how important it is, a thorough investigation and accountability. I am glad that the Criminal Court seized this situation, that the prosecutor's office was already here. I fully support the International Criminal Court, and I appeal to the Russian Federation to accept to cooperate with the International Criminal Court.
I think Putin is benefiting from the war because it was unpopular in Russia at first, but the Western campaign to silence any criticism and to constantly demonize Russian culture that is visible from Russia, has created support for the war. It has distracted Russians from Russian internal problems. Now they want this war to be won, whereas Putin had many internal problems. If Putin wages a war, or if Bill Clinton wages a war, the differences are not enormous, right? There were many jokes at the time that Bill Clinton bombed Serbia because in the media in the United States, they were talking about Monica Lewinsky.
Lewinsky, yes.
So, girl trouble.
Do you want to hear the bizarre part of the story about Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, and about it is tied with the media picture of USA when USA starts the war? Basically, you can see one movie that's called Wag the Dog. It's the name of the movie, and the story of that movie. By the way, it's starring it's not Al Pacino. Robert De Niro is one of the main characters. And the basic story is this, that American president has a sex scandal, and therefore they invent the war. They create the war that doesn't exist in Albania. And of course, Albania is near Serbia, near Kosovo, so you get the picture. And basically, they are dealing with the way Americans are creating wars in order to cover up something, or to create something new in the media, to create the new material for coverage and stuff like that. So basically, it is banal. It is not only because of that, but it has certain similarities.
Chips. We need it for the arm position on the screen. It'll be a kitten. We'll punch it in later, right?
And all the effects of real war.
Okay, put the village behind her.
Give me some sound of screaming.
Without the casualties.
America has seldom witnessed a more poignant picture.
They used the same process with the last Schwarzenegger movie.
Well, I have no insights, and I wouldn't want any into Putin's sex life or his libido, but I was.
Who needs that information anyway?
No. Well, in the West, there's an enormous obsession with the persona of Putin, the personality of Putin. I mean, Putin is he's the Russian national security establishment. He's the face of it, and but there is a need for distraction from internal problems in Russia, and of course that's not to deny that NATO is enormously influential in what led to this conflict. But the way people talk about the conflict, it's as if a conflict exists because of only one factor. No, it's not. It's not either NATO or Putin's ideology, which is as reactionary as any military man's ideology.
Yeah.
There are a number of factors that led to this war, and another one, of course, is that the last major war that Russia fought was in 2002 in Chechnya. 20 years later, what's the average age of a Russian soldier? 20. So they need to fight a war to have, I guess, a drill of some sort, some experience, and Ukraine's familiar territory. So it's a good place to harden and toughen up the soldiers, many of whom will die, of course, or lose a limb. But there's a practical need for that because Putin and the West all knew that Russia was over-reliant on its nuclear arsenal, which it is cautious to use. And so I'm not, a military theorist or West Point or whatever, but some common sense tells me that they want to harden the new generation of soldiers who did not fight in Chechnya, because the Russian operations in Syria were to help the Assad regime against its enemies, was mostly bombings, right? So they needed to toughen up the infantry. This is my cold common sense. I'm not a general.
Toughening up the soldiers, okay, whether it works or not, or whether it is true or not, I wouldn't go into that. But I would ask you about one thing that many people seem to miss. People miss from the international media. They miss that it seems strange that so many people on the left are ready to turn a blind eye on history of fascist ideology of banderism in Ukraine, and the fact that Ukrainian nationalists have actively participated, along with Nazis, in Holocaust against almost 1 million Ukrainian Jews and killed over 100,000 Poles in Western Ukraine. That was in World War II. When I speak, let me explain that. When I speak about banderism, I am referring to Stepan Bandera, Ukrainian fascist whose units participated in Nazi crimes in World War II and whose cult is pretty much alive and well in modern Ukraine. It is strange that anti-fascist principles are applied on a worldwide scale, but not in Ukraine and not by many people on the left, who simply turn the blind eye on that. Why is that?
In their calendar, it marks the birth of Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian partisan forces during the Second World War. The rally was organized by the far-right Svoboda Party. Protesters marched amidst a river of torches and signs saying, "Ukraine above all else." But for many in Ukraine and abroad, Bandera's legacy is controversial. His group, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, sided with Nazi German forces before breaking with them later in the war. Western historians also say that his followers carried out massacres of Polish and Jewish civilians.
I agree, it's irresponsible and stupid. I think there's a lot of ignorance about the reality of the culture in the east of Europe. There is clearly many people who are influential in Ukrainian governments and armed forces are openly nostalgic for Stepan Bandera, and they are deniers of the Holocaust. It's just very, very obvious. They become resentful if you bring up the Holocaust. But every Slavic nationalism has featured anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. In Poland, it's very obvious, and Poland has long been a prominent NATO ally. The European Union was very, very concerned about the state of liberties in Poland when the Polish government began to persecute a historian for speaking about the Holocaust. But they've completely forgotten that. And of course, in Ukraine, it's a bit similar. Zelensky, of course, is Jewish, and you have to be very tough to be a Jewish person in Ukraine, where anti-Semitism, there's no political correctness about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. But Zelensky himself is under enormous pressure from the right wing in Ukraine, and so he went to the Israeli parliament and caused a scandal by telling the Israeli parliament that all the Ukrainians helped to hide Jewish people during the war, which is a horrible distortion of what really happened. It's a terrible disservice. So I think that on the left we only talk about anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, we only talk about it in relation to its misuses in the Israel-Palestine debate. That's the only time we talk about anti-Semitism.
And I would add something to it, because I would say something from the Eastern European and Balkan perspective. Speaking of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, I'm from Southeastern Europe, all in all, you can see the historical revisionism and emerging cult of national state as the essential part of state policies. For example, you have renewal of Orthodox Tsardom fantasies and anti-socialist sentiment in Russia. You have banderism in Ukraine, as we have mentioned. You have monuments in EU country, Latvia. You have a monument dedicated to Latvian SS in Riga. You have the situation that one of the first cities that were where the Jews were completely annihilated was Riga, actually, and Tallinn in neighboring Estonia. You have.
I went to Lithuania to see the Lithuanian Genocide Museum, and nowhere was there any mention of what happened to the Jews in Lithuania. It was all about Lithuanian Catholic resistance against the Soviets. They didn't.
Yes, it is completely idiotic, because all three Baltic republics had their SS divisions in World War II. Actually, Latvia had 2 SS divisions, Estonia had 1, and Lithuania had 1. So 4 SS divisions all in all. And let me add that only a couple of European countries didn't have any SS divisions of their own in the Eastern or the Western Front. And I would also like to add something new for the majority of the audience: revival of Nazi collaborators from World War II on Balkans. For example, Ustaše in Croatia and Chetniks in Serbia. You know, xenophobia and anti-Semitism are on the rise, and no one seems to care. So, if there is a wake-up call for left, and how will that wake-up call look like?
Koji su imale ustaška obilježja. Nakon mise ubijenima, učesnici skupa verbalno su napali i vrijeđali slovenačkog i hrvatskog snimatelja.
Ajde, evo, što mi ti snimati? Ajde, kaj? Naš sad tu već, ćeš mi poslije stavljati na video internet. Vrtiću! Nema je snimat.
Uzam je mobitel. Jesam li te upozorio? Jesam li te upozorio na području si počesto Blajburga?
Po prvi put u centru Blajburga, daleko od mjesta na kojem je održana komemoracija, organizovane su demonstracije zbog ustaškog okupljanja.
Šta za vas znači Ravna Gora?
Ja za to stvarno trenutno nisam u stanju da odgovorim. Evo, pogledajte ovi lepi momci da vam odgovore.
A ovo zbog, brate, mlad čovjek
Ravnogorac. Šta znači za tebe Ravnogorac?
It's astounding also to see how people in the West who seemed very fond of identity politics are supporting this. And I think that what needs to be done is, I guess, to break the illusion that there is so much consensus about this. I think we need to start circulating open letters. Some years ago, I signed an open letter of an organization that I don't agree with, particularly International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. They raised money to publish in the New York Times an open letter announcing or contradicting how Elie Wiesel, who's a very important writer, Nobel Prize winner, how he had supported the settlers in Israel during a certain, a very grisly conflict there. And so there was an open letter of descendants of Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants, including grandchildren, signing this letter in the New York Times. And so that broke the illusion that there's a consensus that, yes, all of us who have a Jewish heritage in the West are very comfortable with support for these Western support for the illegal settlements. And I think there has to be something very similar now coming from this progressive part of the diaspora, confronting this total whitewashing of what is very obvious anti-Semitism among very prominent allies, privileged allies of the West in this conflict, which is not to deny that Russian generals are not very anti-Semitic. And I mean, there are many Russian generals who find that Putin is not sufficiently anti-Semitic to be patriotic for their standards. And so, but I mean, Russia is a madhouse politically, where, you know, it's like pre-modernity, where everyone was right-wing. Before the French Revolution, everyone was right-wing. So Russia is a political madhouse, but that doesn't justify, or that doesn't rule out that Ukraine is also such a madhouse.
Yeah, and then some. That's the whole problem. The whole problem is not. It is also attached with certain things that are attached to European Union. You know, like the story of two totalitarianism, the declaration that was pushed by Eastern European members of European Union that communism and Nazism are alike, and they are the same.
East European, I'm sorry to talk over you, the East European states and Macron from France supported this.
Yeah, it is strange. And the result of that is not only that there is also, again, a big wave of xenophobia. I see it on Balkans because there are many different nations living in a relatively small place, like about 50-60 million people, and every nation has more or less 7 to 10 million people, excluding Romanians. There are 20 million Romanians, but small nations hating each other's guts, plus ruining every monument that is in any way attached to World War II and anti-fascist struggle in our countries. So monuments erected to the glory of partisans, anti-fascist fighters in Yugoslavia are destroyed today. So it is almost a shame to say that your grandfathers fought against Nazis in World War II. It is almost normal to say that they collaborated with them, and it is almost insane to say that they were partisans and fighting for their country. So it is a strange situation in this part of the world, but I see that Poles have also forgotten their anti-fascist movement. They are just sticking with anti-Semitic rhetoric, at least their government is.
Well, I wouldn't go. I think Poland is a bit more complex than that. I think Polish nationalists who resisted the Germans were also tended to be a bit anti-Semitic.
Yes.
So Poland is the identity is a bit more complex. I mean, Europe has more complex problems than the US. But most of the podcasts that are talking now from the left vantage point about whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about Palestine, whether it's about any other issue, are American, right? Like, I mean, I'm a big fan of American comedian Katie Halper, Matt Taibbi, and these people, and there's Breakthrough News. But these are all American podcasts, and so I think that we need to, in order to have these, to foment these discussions, we need to make a similar network of podcasts, but not from the American left position, which inevitably will simplify these very complex problems. We need a complex response to Ukraine, to Poland, to the Balkans, to Israel, Palestine, to which is of course not in Europe, but there's a huge communities from the Middle East that are in Europe, and the refugees want to access Europe mostly. So we need to have we need to look at where the left-wing anti-imperialist podcasters have succeeded, but they're mostly American, and we need to create not just podcasts but spaces for discussions, I think, for this kind of discussion about preserving history and memory. Because what defines the woke left is that they don't have any interests really in history. They don't know a lot of history. They approach history in the supermarket where you make your composition of what's most convenient to you. So.
Hey, listen. This brings us in a way to the third segment, the world crisis and its challenges. For example, let's talk about the common crisis. Okay, the winter is already here. The crisis is already here. The war in Ukraine affects world's economy, health, global wealth, and the countries of the global south are once again pushed aside, even though they're largely dependent on crops from Ukraine and Russia. Ships with grain are mostly blocked in harbors. We can see the shapes of future snowball effect. Food shortages, civil unrest, civil wars, hunger, diseases, and tens, maybe hundreds of millions moving towards Europe and USA. What should be done?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that brings us back to the earlier part. Anti-war movement, of course. We need to look at why all this dependence also. For example, in Venezuela, the government that called itself socialist did not develop agriculture. And so Venezuelans can't really survive the sanctions of the US because they don't have a complex agriculture in the country. They chose to remain dependent on the price of petroleum. So,
but anyway, if the war in Ukraine doesn't stop any soon, if you catch my drift, then millions of people in the global south will stop.
Yes.
Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, and now it is the breadbasket of the big part of the world. So basically, if there is no food.
Well, Ukraine and Russia.
Ukraine and Russia too, but Russia is also blocked in a way because it is in the war and sanctions and everything around it.
I mean, how to resolve that materially, I can't say I know.
But diplomatically, you need Black Sea to be the sea that will be free for the trade, because you have two routes for Russian and Ukrainian goods to reach the world right now. The European part of the Russia, as well as Ukraine, is the most fertile part of the land of the ex-Soviet Union. So basically, you have Baltic, and you have only two major ports that belong to Russians: Kaliningrad, which is already surrounded by Poland and Lithuania, so it's no go, and the other one is St. Petersburg. And on the south, you have many different ports that could be used to deliver food to Turkey, and of course, via Turkey to Middle East and Africa, and down to the Suez, to Egypt. So basically, the only way to solve that, I asked you if you agree with that, is to create some kind of peace agreement or the ceasefire, at least to feed those hungry mouths.
Oh, well, in the short term, absolutely. But let's not forget that we are also approaching a time similar to the 1990s, where at least half of the world was under US sanctions. The people of Afghanistan, for example, the famine in Afghanistan caused by US sanctions. The famine in Yemen is caused by the war. No one's talking about negotiating an end to that war. Bernie Sanders withdrew on Twitter his opposition to the support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And the only person who really reprimanded him was an ex-Republican, Justin Amash. So
talking about this,
there are other wars causing famines. The war in Ethiopia is causing a famine, and I think the Western left had an extremely simplistic position on the Ethiopian war. There are many wars and conflicts that are raging right now that bring with them this other horseman of the apocalypse. This is famine. It's not just the Ukraine war causing hunger. It's also a combination of wars that which the watching world attempts no diplomacy. The watching world does not attempt to be a diplomatic mediator between Israelis and Palestinians without US interference. We don't dare to do that. That would end hunger of these teenagers in Gaza, which Gaza is under a blockade for decades. No, not decades. Sorry, I have to double fact check that. But, you know, there are many food crises that have not just environmental, but clear geopolitical military causes that are not Ukraine and Russia. And we shouldn't forget those.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about one phenomenon. Western European progressives and leftists are very intrigued with movements in global south, such as Sahrawi Polisario in Western Sahara or Kurds. But at the same time, they totally neglect the very fact that there are troops of EU countries in Mali or Congo. Yes. They don't talk about the position of overseas territories. Basically, you were born on one of overseas territories, if I'm correct.
Yes.
That are owned by Netherlands, UK, France, Spain, US. Plus, they don't pay any attention on series of civil wars in Africa. There's also a civil war in Central African Republic as we speak. There is also a civil war in Somalia, the neighbor of aforementioned Ethiopia. And the war in Yemen took almost 400,000 lives, with high death tolls among underage population dying of hunger. The war in Syria continues, but no one pays any attention to it. So are these topics really irrelevant?
Shamima Begum, they pay attention if it's about Shamima Begum, this British Pakistani or Bangladeshi girl who got lost in Syria, who is probably a not very pleasant person to be with. But
why do you say that?
Well, the British media does talk about Shamima Begum, this lady who went to Syria. That's what well, Syria, okay, is another country that's under Western sanctions. The left opposed sanctions against Iraq, opposed the invasion of Iraq. But somehow, you know, where the left is afraid to do that when it comes to Syria, even though I clearly, one shouldn't support Assad, although some people on the left who are a minority, they do support. So this Kurdistan, West Sahara,
Yeah. Let me rephrase that. I mentioned that there are some fancy locations that are more interesting for some progressives than the actual locations where the real violence and starvation en masse is taking place.
Well, terrible things are happening to those poor people in West Sahara who live under an occupation that...
it lasts 45 years.
Well, the left has always responded to causes of small nations, nation states. And I think that you once told me that this is not that much of a conflict with the Leninist idea that first there is some kind of national liberation movement, then there is socialism. Right.
Basically, that's not the point. The point is that this movement, this conflict goes on and off for the last 45, almost 48 years. But it is not, I'm not underestimating the suffering and the casualties that people in Western Sahara have. I'm just shocked how much time they dedicate to that particular story and none of the time to other stories that have even more casualties and even more suffering.
Well, I think in these two, it's a case of Western, naivety, lack of information, our eagerness to make the same mistakes all over again. Remember that a big part of the progressive movement, like Nation magazine, was very supportive of the Israeli position for many, many years, also because the Israelis, they had an army which integrated women, just as the Kurdish army has prominent places for women. The Israeli society seemed progressive because it had its socialist, part of the population. That was not a reason to completely dismiss what Israelis achieved, but that was certainly not a reason to say they had a right to expropriate and occupy Palestinians and to ignore the reality of that terrible campaign against the Palestinians. But I think that we see this repeating itself of Kurdistan in a way, which is not to say that the Kurds are doing the things that Israelis are doing or have done in the earlier phases, but in terms of militarily, but there's an eagerness to support anything that is like, an exception in the Arab world. There was once this idea of pan-Arabism, of the Arab states, peoples becoming more united, secular regimes that were a bit more internationalist and distributed the benefits of the oil among the people, Nasser, right? That was the era of the ideological conflicts, the non-aligned movement, and now we are in this post-ideological era where there's a naive support for the Kurdish cause, even though, without thinking, wait a minute, is it that great to support further fragmentation of the Arab world? Do we know what we're doing here? Do we know what we're doing when we go and volunteer to fight with IPG or support the YPG forces together with the United States? What are we doing here, really? And so there's a lack of reflection, and it's a bit similar to Ukraine, which is also, I'm not dismissing struggles of national liberation, but there's also an unwillingness to get informed. And, in the case of, for example, the support for Western Sahara, you know, it's a missed opportunity because you have huge Moroccan minorities in the north of Europe, many young people who really want to do something to change Morocco, supporting the uprisings in the region of Hirak, which is a very poor area of Morocco from which many people immigrated.
Yes.
So people in this region of Morocco, they heard about all the democratic rights people have in Europe, and they thought, well, that sounds swell, you know. So they started doing these protests, and that shook up Morocco. That spread to, I think it spread to Algeria, and that moment was completely forgotten. There was also fear that this would be another Arab Spring with the catastrophe that followed. But of course, a mass movement in Morocco is truly a mass movement. That's a very large country with masses of people. That was important, and it was very important for the outcome of the Spanish Civil War also. And so a century ago, and so I think it's a missed opportunity of the left to search desperately for a very small national cause, as if it really is.
So in the end, do you see that today's situation has a certain dilemma, like socialism or barbarism? But in this case, it is almost socialism or Armageddon.
Well, Joe Biden observed the possibility of Armageddon quite passively while continuing to indulge in what will get us there. I think that, you know, I guess socialism sounds better, but I'd like to remember what Frantz Fanon said. Frantz Fanon from Martinique, who died an Algerian and a great thinker about the psychology of revolutions. He said that, you know, what matters is not what we call this system, but whether it achieves this redistribution and these goals, these rights, not whether we call it right or left or capitalist or socialist. That's not as important as what it does.
So when it does, well, basically it sounds like socialism.
Yeah, if it looks like socialism,
then it is. Okay, so let's end this up on a lighter, optimistic note. Thank you very much, Arturo, for this conversation. I hope that our viewers have enjoyed with us too, as well as we have enjoyed our conversation. And we will see you next time soon. I was talking with Aruban writer, poet, visual artist Arturo Desimone. My name is Aleksandar Novakovic from Social Movement Flame.